Hey friends, it's Pastor Fieberkorn with you here, Tuesday, January the 30th. Time for Tuesdays with Marty. A little bit of a longer quote from Dr. Luther today. I thought this kind of fit in with some of the things that we've been hearing in our epistle reading on Sunday mornings. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but Luther said this. He said, if the apostles, who were also Jews, had dealt with us as we Gentiles deal with the Jews, there would never have been a Christian among the Gentiles. Since they dealt with us Gentiles in such brotherly fashion, we in turn ought to treat the Jews in a brotherly manner. For even we ourselves are not yet all very far along, not to speak of having arrived. Okay, so some of you might be familiar with Luther's late writings against the Jews, which were rather harsh, sometimes called his anti-Semitic writings. Luther was probably suffering from a little bit of senility at the end of his life, if not at least just grouchy old man syndrome. And he wrote some things against the Jews which are very regrettable. And certainly we're not trying to absolve him of accountability for his words. But many people have said that the Holocaust can be placed at Luther's feet just as much as it can be placed at Hitler's feet. And there's a great book about this called The Fabricated Luther that dispels that myth. Luther's writings against the Jews cannot be apologized for, but they can be seen in context. And they should also be balanced with what he said throughout his life. For instance, this right here. See, what Luther realized is the Jews dealt very gently with the Gentiles in early Christianity, ultimately deciding that circumcision would not be a requirement to become a Christian, which was in truth with the gospel, but also a large concession. In other words, they quickly acquiesced to the fact that Christ had come not just for the nation of Israel, but for all people, for Jew and Gentile. And they worked hard. None worked harder than the Apostle Paul, he says, to win over the Gentiles to the Christian faith. So now Luther's standing here 1,500 years later and asking the largely Gentile Christian population, how are we treating the Jews in our midst? Because whether or not they were being oppressed in the manner of the 20th century yet, there's always been sort of an anti-Semitic strain running through any society. The Jews are always sort of looked at askance, which would be expected for the chosen people of God. But Luther's saying, maybe we ought to consider how we treat them, right? We may be frustrated they haven't accepted Jesus as the Messiah. We may not like the way we interact with them in society, but let's look in the mirror, he says. We're not all that far along either, are we? Have we arrived at the destination that God is calling us to? No, we haven't. And so that ought to give us a degree of humility when dealing with those who are outside the faith. Kind of like what Seminary in Hamas preached on this past weekend with the notion of food sacrifice to idols, right? These Gentile Christians who had been caught up in the worship of the Roman gods, that might trouble their conscience to eat a piece of meat that had been sacrificed to Zeus, because that was part of their prior life of worshiping that false deity. And now that they're a Christian, they feel like they need to leave that behind them. Whereas the Christian might say, Zeus doesn't exist, meat's on sale. It's just as good as the piece of meat that was non-sacrificed to Zeus. Let's get this. And so the Jew, but then would maybe abstain from doing that if it was going to offend a Gentile who had just come to the faith. And so they treated them gently, in other words. In fact, most of the New Testament and the letters is wrestling out this problem of Jew and Gentile and realizing that this faith that had once been for the Jews alone, Jesus, I came first for the lost sheep of Israel, but then also, of course, he comes for all nations. And so we can think about this in any aspect of our life, really. We don't have to be just thinking about non-Christians, but we ought to think about how we treat others, to treat them in a brotherly manner, and to realize that for every stone we might hurl at someone we don't like for how they act, we should look in the mirror and remember that we too have a lot of work to do. As Jesus once said, take the log out of your own eye before you remove the speck in your brother's eye. So good guidance from Luther this Tuesday morning. God's continued peace to you. We'll see you later in the week.